This is a presentation that I gave yesterday to the plenary meeting of ALICE. That's the European Technology Platform for Logistics. Unfortunately, there was a technical hitch during my talk, which prevented many of the delegates from hearing it. So I promised to narrate and video the presentation for their benefit, and so here it is. Almost exactly 2 years ago, ALICE published its roadmap for the decarbonisation of European logistics, which used a framework that I had applied in my 2018 book on decarbonising logistics. So they asked me to provide a brief review of developments over the past couple of years that are likely to affect the implementation of the roadmap. The roadmap is built on what we call 5 decarbonisation levers. These are categories of initiative that will help us to decarbonise logistics. The first aims to reduce the demand for freight transport. The second switches as much freight as possible to lower carbon transport modes. The third makes better use of vehicle assets. The fourth improves the energy efficiency of logistics operations. And the final one shifts logistics from fossil fuel to low carbon renewable energy sources. Just some general reflections. First of all, I think that framework is as robust and comprehensive today as it was 2 years ago. I've not encountered any new decarbonisation interventions that wouldn't fall into one of these 5 categories. Often when I present this framework in presentations, I'm asked what the relative contribution will be of each of these levers to the future decarbonisation of logistics. Regrettably, we're no further ahead really in quantifying that at the macro level, mainly I think because we lack the necessary data. But we would also have to say that these levers will have a different impact over different timescales, and that will complicate the analysis. So my standard response is to say that to get logistics down to zero emissions, we will have to rely very heavily on the 5th category of measures. But nevertheless, in the meantime, in the short to medium term, we've got to focus on the other ones to reduce the amount of energy in logistics that we will ultimately have to defossilize. One thing that has happened over the past 2 years is that the climate science has become much more worrying. Much of the climate science was synthesized in the 6th assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that was published in September this year, indicating how little of the carbon budget for 1.5 degree temperature increase now remains. I mean, if we had begun to reduce our emissions in 20 or 30 years ago, then we could have slid more gracefully down this carbon reduction curve. Now we've got to jump off this precipice, and so we have to reduce our emissions dramatically. Emitting CO2 at the current level would give us only about 8 years to stay within our carbon budget. Now, as I'm sure many of you are aware, the UN has a programme called the Race to Zero, with many signatories, countries, businesses, cities, committing to become net zero logistics. But the emphasis here is, of course, on the word net. They're not aiming to be zero in absolute or gross terms. This will involve much sequestration, much removal of greenhouse gas already in the atmosphere, and many climate scientists are currently concerned about this concept of net zero. This is some quotes from a paper published recently by some climate scientists saying that within a few decades we will need to transform our civilization from one that currently pumps out 40 billion tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere each year to one that produces a net removal of tens of billions. And they say net zero has licensed a recklessly cavalier burn now, pay later approach, which has seen carbon emissions continue to soar. And one thing that concerns me is what the logistical implications will be of implementing a negative emission strategy, one designed to draw emissions out of the atmosphere, and to do that at a planetary scale. So in the longer term, it may be necessary to add a sixth lever to the ALICE roadmap relating to sequestration, because it may then be necessary for us to intensify our efforts to capture greenhouse gases already in the atmosphere. What I will do in the rest of this presentation is provide a brief progress report on each of the other 5 levers, starting with the growth of freight demand. Now, obviously, over the past couple of years, COVID has had a big impact on freight traffic levels. The latest statistics from Eurostat suggest that in the second quarter of 2020, when we had the sort of maximum suppression of commercial and industrial activity in Europe, there was about a 9% reduction in freight movement by road. Some people may have felt that that figure would have been greater, but also there was a fairly rapid rebound from that reduction. And I think this has got implications really for public policy in this area, because if ever we came to a time when policymakers had explicitly to suppress the amount of freight movement, this illustrates how difficult that would actually be in practice. In the public policy arena, of course, there's been much more interest in decarbonising by shifting freight to lower carbon modes. That's been by far the main sustainable logistics initiative for decades, without much success. If one looks at the stability of the freight modal split in Europe, you can maybe say that the main effect of public policy has been to protect rail and water from losing even more market share. And since the ALICE roadmap was published 2 years ago, there's actually been about an 8% reduction in the amount of freight moved by rail. But undeterred, the European Commission, when it published its Sustainable and Smart Mobility Strategy almost exactly a year ago, it set very ambitious targets for the growth of rail freight in Europe, expecting it to rise by 50% by 2030 and 100% by 2050. Worth noting that these are mode-specific targets. It's not a modal split target as such, and a modal split would be of more relevance here to decarbonisation. It's going to be very difficult, it seems to me, to achieve those targets, partly because in 2020 about a fifth of the freight tonnage moved by rail in Europe was fossil fuel, and of course we're going to be phasing that out over the next few decades. But to end on a more positive note, my university with the European Freight and Logistics Leaders Forum did a survey last year of just over 90 logistics executives in Europe, and one question that we asked them was what they thought would be the most cost-effective way of decarbonising logistics, and as you can see, by a significant margin, they reckoned that shifting freight to cleaner modes would be the most cost-effective way of achieving that. The third lever in the ALICE framework would improve the utilisation of vehicle capacity, and that lever specifically refers to collaboration as a way of improving asset utilisation. The survey that I've just mentioned that we did last year of over 90 logistics executives also inquired about the current level of supply chain collaboration in Europe. The executives were asked to rate on a scale of 1 to 6 the extent to which their companies were currently collaborating. And as you can see, in the case of collaboration with suppliers, customers and logistics providers, they gave a score of 3.8 on average. Much less common is collaboration with competitors in the supply chain, so that what we call horizontal logistics collaboration is still not widely practiced. Another question we asked was about the benefits that companies derive from logistical collaboration, and again quite a positive message, saying that there was almost equal economic and environmental benefit from collaborating with others. But we also asked about the barriers to intercompany collaboration, and as you can see that there are still constraints upon this, things like competitive pressures, companies' desire to remain independent, internal management cultures, concerns about data privacy. These things are still obstructing supply chain collaboration in Europe. Another facilitator of collaboration and indeed of decarbonisation in general is digitalization. Again, we sought the views of the executives on this subject, and they were very positive. As you can see, a very high proportion reckoned that in terms of decarbonisation, the impact of digitalisation would be very high or transformational. And relative to their assessment of the effects of decarbonisation over the previous 5 years, they're expecting a dramatic change really in the next few years. Just looking at macro level statistics on this, Eurostat provides data on the empty running of trucks in Europe, and unfortunately, if you track that statistic through time, what you see is that the empty running percentage has been fairly flat now for many years. There are a few signs that that is reducing, and one recent development may actually increase the amount of empty running in Europe. That's the implementation of the EU's mobility package, which will require drivers and vehicles to return to their home countries over an 8-week cycle. There have been two studies that I'm aware of. One I was involved in myself, the Ricardo study for the European Commission, which constructed 3 scenarios looking at the environmental effects of this measure, and they reckoned that could increase truck kilometres, empty truck kilometres and CO2 emissions by between 0.8 and 4.6%. And then KPMG have done a study using Bulgarian data, and they reckon that this measure could increase CO2 emissions by 2%. So what we see here is a conflict, if you like, between public policy measures which could have an adverse effect on decarbonisation, unfortunately. The third lever in the framework aims to improve the energy efficiency of logistics. Very difficult to monitor that currently in Europe because we lack macro level data on the fuel efficiency of freight transport. But one important development worth reporting is the introduction in 2019 of fuel economy standards for new trucks in Europe. If they are successful, then by 2025 that will see a 15% improvement in the carbon efficiency of new trucks and a 30% improvement by 2030, although there is to be a review of this programme in 2022, possibly to modify the 2030 target. Currently, it's estimated that these fuel economy standards by 2030 might reduce carbon emissions from road freight by around 54 million tonnes. There was a study done recently by ING Bank and TNO, which looked at the main sources of future improvements in truck fuel efficiency up to 2030, reckoning that things like tyres, engines, obviously aerodynamics, hybridisation, lightweighting of the vehicles could collectively improve the energy efficiency of road freight by between 28 and 33%. And it's very important that during this decade we make a big effort to improve the fuel efficiency of diesel powered vehicles, because it will take time for us to transform the fleet to a new generation of low carbon vehicles. Based on Eurostat data in 2017, I estimated that it takes about 13 years to replace the European truck fleet. There was a study published last year by PricewaterhouseCoopers which estimated that by 2030 around 90% of the vehicles of the trucks in European roads will still be diesel powered. And therefore we have to do everything we can to improve their energy efficiency before we make the full transition to the next generation of low carbon trucks. Which leads us to the final decarbonisation lever, which aims to cut the carbon content of the energy we use in the logistics sector. And in the case of freight transport modes, there are a broad range of options for switching to renewable fuels. There has been a debate, which is, I think, as intense today as it was 2 years ago, on what the relative contributions will be of these different forms of alternative low carbon energy. There's a lot of disagreement, a lot of lobbying indeed, which we see, for example, in the road freight sector. I've extracted some quotations here from various reports. Some favouring batteries, others hydrogen fuel cells, and others proposing highway electrification using catenaries. I'm a management specialist rather than a technologist, but what I detect is over the past couple of years the position of batteries has improved as far as long distance trucking is concerned. The battery weight penalty, I think, has reduced. The recharging of battery powered trucks has accelerated, and the total cost of ownership, I think, has declined. And so if anything, that seems to me to have strengthened the positions of batteries. But nevertheless, I think there's an important contribution to be made by hydrogen fuel cells and highway electrification. I had the pleasure last month of attending the COP26 climate change conference in Glasgow, where there was an important announcement made with respect to road freight. There was a memorandum of understanding signed by 15 countries and many companies and subnational governments. And this is to ensure that by 2035 there would only be low emission vehicle sales. It would effectively ban the sale of diesel powered vehicles, the lighter ones less than 26 tonnes by 2035, and the heavier vehicles by 2040. And that commitment by these countries is expected therefore to accelerate the move to low carbon vehicles. But one other important point I think that needs to be made here is the dependence of the decarbonisation of logistics upon the decarbonisation of electricity generation. And the good news here is that over the past couple of years, the average carbon intensity of electricity in Europe has continued to decline. And this is essential because we're essentially electrifying freight transport to decarbonise it. And we need that low carbon electricity either directly to recharge batteries or to feed catenary systems, or to make the green hydrogen that we'll need for fuel cells, or as an ingredient for other low carbon fuels. So we really have to constantly monitor the rate at which electricity is decarbonising. And finally, I'd like to mention one factor which I think is inhibiting the decarbonisation of road freight in Europe, and that is the very high fragmentation of the European trucking industry. There are over 500,000 small carriers, many of them operating just one or a few vehicles. With the support of the Smart Freight Centre and Transporion, my university did a survey of over 800 small carriers, asking about their attitudes towards decarbonisation. And you can see that the vast majority of them attach high importance to decarbonisation. But then when we asked them how much business benefit they felt they would derive from this, about 60% of them suggested that they would get very little business benefit. And so there's a question of how we incentivize this multitude of small carriers to more actively decarbonise their operations. What the survey also revealed was a relatively low level of awareness and implementation of the more technical things that businesses can do to help to decarbonise their operations. And one of the recommendations that emerged from this study was that the users of these services, the shippers, but also the bigger logistics providers that are subcontracting much of their road freight, that they can do more to assist the small carriers. And one other initiative which has occurred recently, which I think should facilitate this process, is the formation of the Sustainable Freight Buyers Alliance, which was launched at the COP26 conference. Because as part of that, I think the shippers and the large logistics providers can maybe help to incentivize and to advise small carriers on how they can decarbonize their operations. So I think this is another important initiative which I think will make a contribution to the implementation of the 5 ALICE levers. So I hope you found that presentation of interest. There's the book that I mentioned that I published in 2018, and there are also the links to the 2 surveys that I've mentioned in the course of the presentation, the one of the logistics executives and then the more recent one which looked at small carriers in Europe. So thank you for your attention.